Hi, Richard Young from New Zealand Photography Workshops. I'm here today up above Lake Wanaka at this stunning location we visit on some of our workshops here. And what I'd like to run you through is how to use your camera in manual mode for landscape photography. Before we dive into shooting in manual mode itself, I just want to do a bit of an overview of some of the exposure settings. So there's three settings in our camera that control our exposure: our ISO, our aperture, and our shutter speed. So let's look over these one by one to start with. First of all, our ISO. So ISO controls how sensitive the camera sensor is to light. A lower ISO, like ISO 100, and the camera's less sensitive to light. A higher ISO, like 400, the camera's more sensitive to light. It also affects the amount of noise in the image. So lower ISOs, like 100, have a lot less noise than a really high ISO, like shooting at 6400. So for that in mind, we always want to keep our ISO as low as possible, because that's going to have the least amount of noise in our image. Also at those lower ISOs, we actually get more dynamic range out of the camera, so that's going to help us in those really sort of harsh contrasty lighting situations. So next up, our aperture. So aperture is the opening of the lens, so it's essentially the iris inside the lens, and it's controlling how much light comes in through the lens and then will hit the sensor. Aperture can be quite confusing, quite counterintuitive in the way that it's numbered because it's all on fractions, but a large aperture like f2.8 lets in a lot of light into the lens, and we call it a large aperture because it's a big opening. But then a small aperture, f22, because it's a small opening, only lets a small amount of light into the camera. So therefore it's going to control our exposure, how much light's coming into the camera. Like ISO, there's something else it affects, and that's our depth of field. So depth of field is how much is in focus. So it's not what's in focus, where we're focusing in the frame, it's how much is in focus. So we're focusing here, it's how much either side of that is in focus. So with very large apertures like f2.88, we get what we call a very shallow depth of field. So only our subject is in focus. But if we use a smaller aperture like f22, we get much larger depths of field. So the whole landscape can be in focus. So theoretically for landscape photography, you would think probably f22 is the best aperture because it would give us everything in focus, and that's what we're trying to achieve, that sort of real sharp focus from the foreground through to the background. Although there's one problem we run into, and that's diffraction. So what diffraction is, when we use those really small apertures like f22, where we've got multiple waves of light, they actually all bend at different angles through such a small hole, and we end up with a softer image. So we're not talking about what's in focus or if it's in focus, we're talking about overall sharpness. So with those very small apertures, we don't get as sharp an image. Now, of course, this is a property of the lens because the apertures are a property of the lens, but generally speaking, as a general rule, we really start to lose sharpness after f11. So with that in mind, f11 will normally give us the sharpest image before we start losing that sharpness. Also, it gives us quite a good depth of field. So on a 24mm lens, on a full frame camera, at f11, we can actually get 2 meters all the way through to infinity in focus. So that's a really good depth of field. We can work with something 2 meters away and get that and the distant mountains all in focus. So for that reason, so f11's become a real go-to aperture for shooting landscape photography. Next up, shutter speed. Now, shutter speed in some ways is the least important and the most flexible setting when we're shooting landscape photography. So we're essentially a lot of the time using our shutter speed to control our exposure. But let's just review what shutter speed is. So it's the opening of the shutter, the actual physical mechanical shutter that's opening, that's letting the light hit the sensor. And it's the time it's open for. So we can have a very fast shutter speed, like a 0.04 of a second, that it's going to open and close really quickly. Or a very long shutter speed, like a second, that it's going to stay open for a prolonged period and let a lot more light in. So it's going to control the amount of light that comes in. Like ISO and like Aperture, there's actually something else it controls as well, and that's movement. Because if our shutters open for a longer period of time and movement happens during that period, it's going to capture or blur that movement. So it can have an effect when there's moving objects in an image, or maybe we're moving the camera. So with that in mind, in relation to landscape photography, generally we're shooting on a tripod, so the camera movement isn't such an issue. As in terms of movement in the landscape, well, it depends what sort of landscape we're shooting. Generally landscapes are quite still, but we do get movement with, say, trees or grass in the wind, and also water, so it can have a huge impact on capturing water or subjects like trees that are moving in the wind. But generally it's one of the more flexible settings out of the three. So now that we've looked over these settings, let's look at shooting in manual mode itself. So first of all, why would you want to shoot in manual mode, and why not shoot in automatic mode in your camera? Well, there's a number of reasons to shoot in manual mode. One, it gives us full control over all three of those settings, and we're manually setting those for the best optimized shooting conditions. Also, it actually almost becomes easier than shooting in some of the semi-automatic modes to fine-tune and get our exposure just right, because we've got full control over our exposure, and we can adjust one of those settings and increase or decrease our exposure. And when you start working with more complex exposure situations, and also starting to work with filters, it becomes almost essential. When you're using ND filters and you're trying to work out the exposures of ND filters, it can be extremely difficult to shoot in an automatic mode. Lots of people really get put off by shooting in manual mode because they think it's really complex. But I actually find for landscape photography, I actually find it easier than shooting aperture or shutter speed priority. And the reason is, we've got a bit of time, we can take our time, we're not having to rush about and get that exposure. And also, quite a few of the settings we're using are quite fixed because we're trying to get the best shooting conditions and the optimum depths of field and the least amount of noise. So first of all, let's just think about some of those settings that we've run over. So that ISO, we were saying like the lower ISO gives us the least amount of noise. So generally speaking, we want to be using that. And on most cameras that's 100, on some cameras it's 200, on some cameras like this Nikon D850 it's actually ISO 64, but that lowest native ISO. And if we use that lowest native ISO, that will give us the least amount of noise in the image. And we don't really want to increase that unless we actually have to for one reason or another. So pretty much 90% of the time when I'm shooting landscape photography, I'm shooting on this camera, Nikon D850 at ISO 64. And I'm locking that in place and I'm not adjusting that. So that almost takes one of these three settings out of the equation. So next of all, let's look at our aperture. When we were talking about aperture, we spoke about f11 and how that gives us a really good depth of field, but we're not really having that effect of diffraction, so we're not losing that sharpness. So it's sort of our optimum aperture for getting everything sharp and in focus. So for that reason, like when I'm taking big landscapes, again 90% of my big landscape images are shot on f11. So a bit like ISO, it's almost fixing that setting. So we've almost fixed our ISO at 64 or 100 or 200 or whatever your native is, and then your aperture there at f11. So with that in mind, we've only got 1/3 variable, and that's our shutter speed. But really, before we just dive into that and go into our shutter speed, there is actually a fourth variable, and that is the light, the amount of available light. And you might think this is a variable that we can't control, but in some ways we can. We can come back on a brighter day, we can come back on a darker day, or we could use neutral density filters to control the amount of light that's coming in the camera. But our shutter speed, which is our final exposure control setting, is really going to be governed by the amount of light. Because if we're fixing both our aperture and our ISO, our shutter speed is the only variable left. So what we're going to normally do is adjust our shutter speed to the amount of variable light. And if we're shooting a landscape that hasn't got movement in it, that there's not flowing water, there's not moving trees, it doesn't really matter if we're shooting on 4 seconds or if we're shooting on 1/4 of a second, because it's not going to make any difference in the image. So with that in mind, let's now jump in the camera and have a look at some of those exposure settings and set this up. So I've got this view at the moment that I'm just shooting out across the other end of the lake here. I've set my ISO to ISO 64 and I've set my aperture to f11. Now what I need to do is I need to work out the shutter speed that I'm going to use to get the correct exposure, and to do this I'm going to utilize the light meter in the camera. So there's this little light meter that comes up in the viewfinder in the camera or on the back rear view screen, and it's got a 0 and it's got a plus and a minus, and then it's got these little dashes both sides of it, and there's a big dash and there's 2 small dashes before that. The big dash denotes a full stop of light, and the smaller dashes denote 1/3 of a stop. So we'll get to that in a minute and the difference between those 4 and those 1/3 stop adjustments, but what I need to just focus on to start with is that zeroing it out. So what we're going to do is we're going to adjust our shutter speed on our camera, and as we adjust our shutter speed we'll see that exposure bar move up and down. Sometimes if you're too far off one side of it, it shows a little plus and it's right the way off the other side. But I can move that up and down to get that centered right in the middle. Once I've got that centered in the middle, I can theoretically take a photograph there. So if I was shooting in aperture priority mode, that's actually what my camera's going to do. It's going to zero it out on that 0, and that's what I'm going to shoot on. So it's essentially almost the same as shooting in aperture priority mode. And I'm going to take a picture here and I'm going to look at the image. Now you think, well, why wouldn't I just shoot in aperture priority mode and let the camera do it itself? Well, that's a very good point. The thing is, this is the best exposure governed by the camera's meter, light meter, and it's not always going to be right. It's going to give us a good starting point, and that's all I look at it as, is a starting point. So I'm then going to review my histogram, and I think histograms are the most important tool in shooting in manual mode. And we're not talking about the live view histograms here, we're talking about the review histograms. So if I go into the review mode of my camera and I then look down and I can cycle through and I can press the display button or the info button to cycle through those different display setups, and I'm going to bring up the one that shows the histograms. Now, I much prefer full RGB histograms that show the histogram for each one of the channels rather than just a complete overall histogram. So once I've got that up, I can then govern my exposure and see if my exposure's right. And obviously, like, just to quickly recover histograms, like, our histograms are perfect mountain shape and it should be essentially in the middle. If it's to the right, it's overexposed. If it's to the left, it's underexposed. So I'm going to look at that histogram and see if it's over or underexposed. One other tool I can use here is also the highlight clipping. So turning on that highlight clipping warning in my camera to see if there's any areas of the image that are overexposed to the point of no return. And I can look at that histogram and decide if I need to increase or decrease the exposure. So if the image was too bright, I would want to decrease the exposure. If it was too dark, I would want to increase the exposure. Now, how much would I increase or decrease the exposure by? Now, this is where we come back to that whole thing about stops and these 4 adjustments of light. So we can adjust a full stop of light by our shutter speed, by our aperture, or by our ISO. And those 4 adjustments are going to half or double the amount of light coming to the camera. So going from, say, ISO 100 to ISO 200 is going to double the amount of light. Going from f11 to f8 is going to double the amount of light. Going from 1/4 second to 1/2 second is going to double the amount of light. So, and likewise, if we want to reduce that exposure, going from ISO 400 to ISO 200 is going to halve that amount of light. So I don't really want to adjust my ISO or my aperture because I want to leave those fixed. So what I'm actually going to adjust is my shutter speed. Now, so I probably want to adjust it by a full stop because that might actually be too much, and this is where the third of the stops come in. So I might just adjust that back by a third of a stop or 2/3 of a stop if the image was a little bit underexposed. Really good way to get your head round one, how the light meter works, and also what the histograms look like, is to take an image and take it with it zeroed out. So at the moment I'm shooting on ISO 64, I'm on f11, and we're on 0, I'm getting 125th of a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a picture there, and I'm looking at my histogram. It's about right. I've got a tiny bit of clipping just in those clouds in the sky there, but it's very minimal, and it probably only needs a third of a stop adjustment really to fix that. But what I'm going to do, and what I suggest you do if you're trying to get your head round both your exposure meter and your histogram, is go back to your shooting mode, and now let's try and take a picture that's underexposed. So we want to take one that's a stop underexposed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the shutter speed, and I'm going to want a faster shutter speed. But remember, we've got those third stop adjustments. So if I just click my camera dial once, that's only going to give me a third stop. So I actually need to click that 3 times. And by reducing that down 3 times, that's given me a shutter speed of 250th of a second, which is halving the amount of light that's coming in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and take another picture of that, and I'll be able to see clearly on my histogram that the histogram's now moved to the left hand side and the image looks underexposed. And then I'm going to do the exact opposite. So I'm going to take one that's a stop overexposed. So I'm going to zero it back out onto 0, which was 125th of a second. And now I'm going to increase my exposure again by a full stop, so that's 3 clicks on my camera dial, 1, 2, 3, and that's got me to a 60th of a second. So I'm going to take a picture there. And I can see on this image it's very, very bright, the histogram's pushed to the right hand side, and I'm also getting that exposure warning coming up on the back of the camera to show that some of the area of the image is overexposed. So just going back to our first image, the one that we zeroed out on the histogram, so that was at 125th of a second. I'm just going to take that image again, and now what I've learned from taking that over an underexposed one, I can then put into this image here and work out if this image is too bright or too dark. And looking at this, I can see that it's a little bit too bright, and that I need to darken it down a little bit just because I've got a tiny bit of highlight clipping in those clouds. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to reduce my exposure just by a third of a stop. So I'm going to bring my shutter speed to 160th of a second, and I'm going to take an image there. I'm going to review my histogram, and I've now got no clipping in the image, and that's the perfect exposure. We've got the most out of that histogram, we've got a nice bright image, but we haven't got any clipping in it. That's how I adjust my exposure. Is I normally zero out my exposure to start with, then I'll review that histogram and decide on I need to increase or decrease the exposure. Now the whole exercise of increasing it by a stop and decreasing it by a stop, I don't suggest you do that with every image. Just do that if you're trying to get your head round it. Normally it's quite small adjustments, and once you get shooting manual mode for a while, you'll get to notice how much of adjustments they make, and if you need to increase or decrease your exposure just by a third of a stop or by a full stop. There's one other thing I just want to cover in regards to our histograms and getting our exposure right. And that's something that we use in landscape photography called ETTR, exposed to the right. So what exposed to the right is, we're essentially trying to expose the image as far to the right, as bright as we can, so as far to the right hand side of the histogram. Now why would we want to do that? Now what I like to say to people is all the gremlins live in the shadows. So essentially, if we look at our histogram and pretend we've got 10 stops of dynamic range on our histogram, and we've only got a scene that's got 7 stops of dynamic range, we can actually push that one way or the other. And we can have a space on the right hand side of the histogram or space on the left hand side of the histogram. Now, I'm not talking about to the point that we push it off the side of the histogram, and it's worth really reviewing over the histogram and settings here, and just that we're not pushing it off the side of the histogram. We're still containing it within the histogram. But theoretically, what we would do with exposure is put it right in the middle, and in theory that's fine, and it does work fine. But all those gremlins almost live in the shadows. That on the dark side of the histogram we've got more noise and we've got more artifacts, so exposing it further to the right gives a lot more data in our file and less noise, and a better image to work with in post-production. So normally when I'm shooting landscape photography, I actually try and shoot the image as far to the right, so essentially as bright as I can. And I just keep increasing that exposure to the point that I can't increase it anymore without clipping some area of the image. And that's why it's really important to have that highlight warning on, because we can increase that exposure and then see that highlight warning and know that we've overexposed the image too much and we need to bring it back a bit more. Now, this is quite an advanced technique, and if you're just getting used to shooting in manual mode, zeroing it out to start with is fine. And also if you're shooting JPEG images, zeroing it out is probably the way to go. But if you're shooting RAW and you're trying to get the most out of your images in post-production, exposing it further to the right will give you a lot more detail in your file that you can then work with in Lightroom or your RAW processing software afterwards. And we can easily darken that back down. It just gives us more latitude to play with. So hopefully from this demonstration you can see shooting in manual mode isn't that difficult, and I just want to do one more run through because we've covered quite a lot there really. So generally speaking, for landscape photography we're using, well, our lowest native ISO, which in this case is ISO 64, and I'm shooting 90% of my images on ISO 64 when I'm shooting on a tripod. And then we want that best aperture, and that's going to give us good depths of field but before we get any diffraction. So for me that's f11 with this camera setup. So I'm almost locking those two, and then I'm just adjusting my shutter speed to get the exposure right for the current lighting conditions. And of course there is more to shooting in manual mode than this, and if we want to then try and get a set shutter speed, we can adjust those other settings. So we can say increase our ISO to let more light in, and then that would give us, say, a faster shutter speed. So hopefully that rounds up nicely sort of shooting in manual mode, why we want to shoot in manual mode, and some of the control it will give us. Now, shooting in manual mode isn't for everyone, and sometimes if you're shooting quickly or you're shooting handheld, shooting one of the semi-automatic modes can be easier. But I personally find when you're shooting on a tripod, things are quite fixed, they're quite stationary. We can work through that process, and I don't find it any more difficult than shooting in aperture or shutter speed priority mode.